Under the dim glow of lantern light, a poor rancher stood in the silence of his worn barn, staring at the only horse he owned. That animal was not just a creature of labor. It was his survival, his livelihood, his only partner in the endless struggle of the frontier. Yet when a stranger arrived at his fence that cold night, wounded, weary, and desperate for a way forward, the rancher faced a choice that could strip him of everything he had left. Against all reason, against the logic of hunger and hardship, he placed the reins into the stranger's hands. His neighbors would later whisper that he had lost his mind. In truth, he had given something far greater than a horse. He had given trust, the kind of trust that costs more than gold in a land built on betrayal. As the night dragged on, the rancher's heart ached with doubt. He paced the small wooden house, staring at the empty corral, wondering if kindness had doomed him. Every hoofbeat in the distance felt like a phantom, every gust of wind like a reminder of what he had lost. Yet he tried to quiet his fears, clinging to the belief that mercy never returns empty. He told himself that even in a world as cruel as the West, there must be value in sacrifice. But still, when sleep finally claimed him, it was the restless kind, the sleep of a man who has gambled everything he owns on the goodness of another soul. At dawn, the rancher awoke to a sound that shook the walls of his small home. It was not one horse, but the thunder of many, rolling across the plains like a storm. He stepped outside, expecting trouble, expecting perhaps the cruel trick of raiders who had heard of his weakness. But what he saw stole the very breath from his chest. 100 riders, fierce and proud, stood before his fence, their horses stamping in the morning light. And in a movement as silent as it was powerful, every single one of them dismounted and knelt. The stranger was among them, no longer ragged, no longer weary, but radiant with strength, his presence commanding the respect of all who surrounded him. He looked upon the rancher not as a beggar looks upon his benefactor, but as a leader looks upon an equal. The rancher's gift had not vanished into the night. It had echoed into something larger, something beyond the reach of doubt. What had seemed like loss had become a bond, and what had seemed like weakness had revealed a hidden strength. In that moment, the poor rancher understood a truth the frontier often concealed. Generosity is never wasted, and sometimes the smallest act of sacrifice summons the greatest return. The sight of 100 riders bowing before his broken fence was not just repayment. It was a revelation. His single act of kindness had written a story the West would never forget, a story where mercy had turned poverty into power, and where a man who had nothing discovered that he truly had everything. The rancher stood frozen at the sight of 100 warriors kneeling before his fence. His land had never known such a presence. Dust rising like smoke, the morning sun catching on polished saddles and worn rifles. For a moment, he thought it was a dream, the kind that vanishes when you rub your eyes. But the sound of hooves, the heat of the animals, and the gravity of so many men bowing before a simple ranch made the truth undeniable. His single act of kindness had summoned something beyond comprehension. The stranger he had aided stepped forward, no longer cloaked in desperation, but cloaked in honor. His voice carried a weight that silenced the entire plain. "Last night you gave me your only horse," he said, "not knowing who I was, not knowing what it would cost you. Today, you see the truth of your gift." He turned to the riders, and in perfect unison, they lowered their heads further. It was not an act of pity, nor of debt. It was reverence, the kind reserved for men who had shown courage without expecting reward. The rancher's neighbors, who had come running at the thunder of hooves, gathered near the fence, their mouths hanging open. These were the same people who had often whispered behind his back, mocking his poverty, pitying his worn clothes and bare fields. Now they stood in silence, their disbelief painted across their faces as they watched the poorest man in the valley receive a tribute no wealthy cattle baron had ever known. Their envy was silent, but their shame was loud in their eyes. The stranger explained that he was not just a wanderer, but a leader of men, tested in battles and bound by a code of loyalty. He told the rancher that among warriors, the greatest honor was not to win or to conquer, but to recognize kindness in its purest form. The gift of a horse in the barren West was more than generosity. It was the gift of life itself. And so, the 100 riders had come not to repay a debt, but to kneel in acknowledgement of a man who, though poor in wealth, was rich in spirit. The rancher felt tears burn at the corners of his eyes. He had never wanted recognition, never wanted riches. He had only acted on instinct, on the faint belief that mercy mattered. Now, standing before an army of men who bowed to him, he understood something he had never dared to dream, that even in the loneliest corners of the frontier, a single act of selflessness could echo louder than the crack of a rifle. It could change everything. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire across the plains. Word traveled faster than hooves, and soon every saloon, trading post, and dusty town spoke of the poor rancher who had given away his only horse and awoke to find 100 riders at his fence. Some called it a miracle, others a fable. But those who had stood there that morning knew it was no tale. They had seen the dust, heard the thunder, and felt the ground tremble under the weight of reverence. The rancher's life began to change in ways he had never expected. Strangers arrived at his land, not to take, but to give. They offered seed, tools, and food, moved not by pity but by respect. The ranch, once on the edge of collapse, began to grow strong again, not through riches but through the strength of community. And though the rancher accepted their gifts, he never let pride replace humility. He told each one who came, "I only did what any man should." Yet deep down, he knew few would have made the same choice. But not all responses were kind. There were those who grew bitter, jealous of the honor the rancher had received. A wealthy cattleman in the valley, known for his greed and cruelty, sneered at the story. It was luck, he said, a trick of fate. No act of charity brings an army to your fence. His words sowed doubt in some, but those who had seen the riders kneel could not be shaken. They carried the memory of that morning like a shield, proof that goodness could indeed command power. The stranger returned often, riding at the head of his men, always stopping at the rancher's home. Sometimes they came to share meals, sometimes to offer protection, sometimes only to sit in silence by the fire. To the rancher, these visits were not about spectacle, but about friendship, a bond forged in the moment he had given away everything and gained more than he had ever known. For the first time in his life, he felt what it meant to be rich, not in gold, but in loyalty. And so, as the rancher looked out over his land at the end of each day, he no longer saw only hardship. He saw the echoes of hooves, the memory of kneeling riders, and the truth that would guide him for the rest of his days. In the unforgiving land of the West, where cruelty often reigned, one man's kindness had become a legend, and that legend was still unfolding. The legend of the kneeling riders began to ripple far beyond the valley. Travelers carried it across rivers and through canyons, telling it at campfires where men of every stripe gathered to share whiskey and stories. Some scoffed at the idea, saying no army of riders would bow to a poor man with nothing to his name. But others, especially those who had known hunger and desperation, nodded in silence. They understood that in the harsh land of the West, true honor wasn't found in power or wealth. It was found in selflessness. The rancher himself never sought the fame that grew around his name. Each morning, he rose as he always had, tending the small patch of land, mending fences, and walking the quiet fields. But now, children from the nearby village would come and sit at his porch, wide-eyed, waiting for him to tell the story. He never embellished it, never added glory. He simply told them the truth, that he had given away the only thing he owned, not because he expected anything in return, but because someone was in need. That was the lesson he wanted them to remember. That kindness carries its own reward. Yet, deep in his heart, the rancher wrestled with unease. Why had he been chosen for such an honor? Why had 100 riders come to kneel at his fence, when so many other men in the valley were stronger, richer, or braver? The question lingered like a thorn, and at night, beneath the lonely stars, he asked himself if he could ever live up to the story others now told about him. The burden of legend weighed heavy on a man who had never sought greatness. The stranger seemed to sense this doubt. On one visit, he told the rancher, "You question why you were chosen. But understand this, we do not kneel to wealth or to strength. We kneel to the kind of man who gives when he has nothing left. That is rarer than gold, rarer than courage." These words sank deep, easing the rancher's heart. For the first time, He allowed himself to believe that his simple act of compassion had meaning beyond what he could see. Still, the West was not a land where peace lasted long. News came that raiders had been spotted near the valley, ruthless men who burned homes and took cattle with no regard for who they destroyed. Fear spread quickly among the ranchers and farmers. But when the people looked for guidance, their eyes turned not to the wealthy cattle baron who boasted of his power, but to the poor rancher whose kindness had once brought 100 warriors to his side. And though he felt unworthy, he knew he could not step back. The land had chosen him to stand. The night before the raiders were expected, the valley gathered at the rancher's fence, the same fence where the riders had once knelt. Families brought lanterns, weapons, and what little food they had left. There was fear in their eyes, but also hope, because they remembered the morning when kindness had turned into strength. The rancher stood before them, his worn hat in his hands, unsure if he had the right words. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "We may not have riches or armies, but we have each other. And if we stand together, no force can take that away." The stranger returned that night with his riders, the thunder of hooves once again echoing across the valley. But this time they did not kneel. They rode in as allies, circling the ranch with precision, their presence a wall of defiance. The people of the valley gasped at the sight, many dropping to their knees in gratitude. The stranger clasped the rancher's shoulder and said, "You gave me your only horse. Tonight, we give you our strength." And in that moment, the valley knew it was not alone. When the raiders came at dawn, they expected fear. Instead, they met resistance like iron. Farmers with pitchforks stood shoulder to shoulder beside hardened warriors. Mothers guarded their children with rifles in hand. And at the center of it all, the poor rancher stood tall, no longer just a man of sacrifice, but a leader forged by loyalty. He was not the strongest, nor the fiercest, but his courage was contagious, spreading through the ranks like wildfire. The battle was fierce, the clash of steel and cries of men echoing across the fields. But the raiders had not expected unity. They had not expected a valley bound not by fear, but by a promise born the night a poor man gave away his only horse. And as the sun rose higher, the raiders broke, retreating into the hills, their defeat carried on the wind. The valley was safe, not because of weapons, but because of the bond of compassion. When silence returned, the people gathered around the rancher, their faces filled with tears and awe. They no longer saw him as just a man who had given away a horse. They saw him as proof that mercy could forge an army stronger than fear. And though he lowered his head in humility, he knew the truth in his heart. Kindness had not only saved a stranger, it had saved an entire valley. The valley never forgot that morning. Word of the victory spread even faster than the tale of the kneeling riders had before. Townsfolk and travelers repeated it in saloons, in trading posts, and along dusty trails, that a poor rancher's single act of kindness had inspired 100 warriors and protected an entire community. To many, it sounded like myth, yet those who had stood in the fields knew it was real. They had seen the fire in the rancher's eyes, felt the ground tremble with the force of unity, and lived because of it. The rancher, however, remained the same. He still rose before sunrise, still mended his fences, still lived in a humble home where the cracks in the wood let the wind whistle through. But something inside him had changed. He carried himself with quiet strength, a man who knew that wealth was not in coin or cattle, but in the bonds forged through sacrifice. He never claimed leadership, but when decisions needed to be made, people naturally turned to him, trusting the judgment of the man who had proven that mercy could be stronger than steel. Yet, even as peace returned, challenges pressed close. Drought struck the valley, drying the rivers, withering the fields, and thinning the cattle. Hunger whispered at every door, and fear began to creep back into the hearts of the people. Some looked to the wealthy cattle baron, who hoarded his resources behind guarded gates. But many turned to the rancher, remembering how he had faced fear before. And though he had little to offer, he shared what he could: his grain, his water, his hope. The stranger and his riders came again, bringing supplies from far-off places, honoring the man who had once honored them. Together, they distributed food and water, refusing to let any child go hungry. The rancher's words became a guide for the valley. When one of us suffers, we all suffer. And when one of us gives, we all survive. Slowly, the drought passed, but the memory of those days bound the people tighter than before. They had learned that unity was not born in comfort, but in hardship endured together. In time, the rancher began to see the truth more clearly. The horse he had given away had not been the loss of his survival, but the seed of a legacy. That choice had changed the fate of not only his own life, but of countless others. He realized that the West, for all its cruelty, carried hidden gifts, the chance for a single man's mercy to ripple outward and become a shield for many. And though he never sought recognition, he knew his story would live long after he was gone. The years continued their march, and the rancher grew older, his hair streaked with silver, his back bent from years of toil. But his spirit remained unbroken, and his presence still commanded respect across the plains. Young men and women came to his porch, eager to hear the story of the night he gave away his only horse and the dawn when 100 riders knelt at his fence. He told it simply, never embellishing, always reminding them that greatness was born not of wealth or power, but of the courage to give when you have nothing. The children of the valley grew up carrying his words in their hearts. Many became riders themselves, warriors and settlers who carved their lives in the harsh land. They carried his story like a compass, guiding them when faced with choices between selfishness and sacrifice. And each time they chose mercy, the spirit of the rancher's act lived on, echoing through generations. His story had become more than a tale. It was a way of life, but not all remembered with reverence. The cattle baron, bitter and jealous until his last breath, tried to erase the story, claiming it had been exaggerated, a trick of the imagination. Yet the people did not forget. They had seen the riders kneel, heard the thunder of hooves, and felt the power of a single act ripple outward like waves in a river. No amount of denial could silence what had been carved into memory. The rancher's story was larger than envy. It belonged to everyone who had lived it. One evening, the stranger returned alone, without his army, to sit with the rancher by the fire. Both men were older now, their faces weathered by time and hardship. They spoke little, but their silence was heavy with respect. Finally, the stranger said, "The night you gave me your horse, you gave me back my faith in humanity. What you did saved not just me, but my men, and in time, this whole valley. That gift will never die." The rancher bowed his head, knowing that such words carried more weight than any riches ever could. As the fire burned low, the rancher realized something he had long suspected. The horse had only been the beginning. The true gift had been the bond created that night, a bond that had carried through battles, through famine, through years of struggle. He had given away his survival, and in return, he had received a legacy. And in the Old West, where lives often vanished into dust and silence, such a legacy was rarer than gold. As the rancher's years stretched on, he became something more than a man in the eyes of the valley. He became a symbol. Songs were sung about him at campfires, and traveling storytellers carried his tale across the frontier, embellishing details but never changing the heart of it, that a poor man's mercy had brought 100 riders to his fence. His name was spoken with reverence, and children were taught to honor kindness not as weakness, but as the truest strength. Even strangers who had never seen his ranch would ride long miles just to greet him, hoping to touch the hand of the man who had given everything and gained the world. Despite the honor, the rancher never lost his humility. He still walked the fields barefoot sometimes, tending the earth with the same quiet devotion as when he had nothing. The people often asked him how he managed to remain so grounded. His answer was always the same, "Because I remember the night I had only one horse, and I remember what it felt like to let it go." His humility wasn't an act. It was a truth carved into him, reminding everyone that real wealth is measured not by what you keep, but by what you give away. But the West had a way of testing even the strongest legacies. One spring, a band of outlaws swept through the valley, not like the raiders of old, but with cunning and greed sharper than any blade. They burned homes, seized cattle, and left families in despair. The valley was afraid again, uncertain if they had the strength to endure. Whispers grew that perhaps the legend had faded, that the memory of one man's mercy was not enough to fight the cruelty of the present. It was then that the rancher, though frail with age, stood once more before his people. His voice was weaker, but his words carried the weight of decades. "Do you think the story lives in me?" he asked. "It lives in you." The morning the riders knelt was not about my horse. It was about us, about what happens when one man chooses to act and others follow. That choice is yours now. His words reignited something long dormant in their hearts, the flame of unity born years ago in the dust of his fence. Together, the valley rallied again, not because of fear, but because of faith in what they had already proven. They stood shoulder to shoulder, farmers, mothers, children, and riders alike, and drove back the outlaws. And as the sun set on their victory, they realized the truth. The rancher's story was not just his. It was theirs, written into every act of courage, every hand that reached to lift another, every moment when mercy overcame fear. In his final years, the rancher often sat quietly at his porch, watching the horizon where the sun rose and set over the fields he had worked his entire life. Visitors came daily, children asking for stories, young riders seeking guidance, and old friends who simply wanted to sit beside him in silence. Though his body was failing, his eyes still carried the same fire they had when he first handed over the reins of his only horse. People said that fire was what kept the valley alive, long after others would have surrendered to despair. One day, sensing his time was near, he gathered the valley at his fence. Families, warriors, children, all came, just as they had so many years before. He told them the story one last time, not to glorify himself, but to remind them of the truth at its core. "The West will always test you," he said. "It will take, it will wound, it will tempt you to harden your heart. But remember this, mercy is stronger than cruelty. And when you give even the little you have, you carry more power than you know." His words lingered in the silence, pressing into every soul like a vow. That night, he passed peacefully, his hands folded, his heart steady. At dawn, just as it had happened long ago, riders filled the horizon. 100 men and women dismounted and knelt at his fence, their heads bowed in honor. It was not just a farewell. It was a promise, a living continuation of a story that had begun with a single horse. The valley wept, but their tears were not only grief. They were gratitude for the man who had given them more than survival. He had given them a way to live. His grave was marked not by stone, but by the stories told around it. For generations, travelers carried his tale, each one adding their voice to the chorus that kept his memory alive. Children grew up hearing that mercy could move mountains, that sacrifice could bring armies, and that a poor rancher once changed the fate of an entire valley with a single act of kindness. His legacy lived not in wealth, but in the choices people made when they faced the same test. And so, in the heart of the Old West, where dust swallowed names and time erased countless lives, the rancher's story endured. The poor man who gave his only horse to a stranger had become eternal, not through riches or monuments, but through the unshakable truth that mercy is the mightiest force of all. The rancher's story, once whispered in firelit corners, became a legend woven into the very fabric of the West. Men spoke of his sacrifice as they rode long trails. Women repeated it while rocking their children to sleep, and children themselves grew up pretending to be the man who gave away his only horse. To many, it was more than a tale. It was a compass pointing toward a truth the frontier often tried to bury, that mercy was stronger than might, and kindness carried farther than cruelty. As years pressed on, the rancher began to feel the weight of time. His hands, once calloused and strong, grew slower, his body bending like the wooden beams of his old barn. Yet his presence never diminished. When people visited, they did not see a frail man, but the living heart of a legend. Even strangers brought offerings, bread, grain, small trinkets, not to honor wealth, but to honor the spirit of giving that had reshaped their valley. He accepted little, but he listened to all, for he knew that stories were the true riches of the land. Still, he sometimes wondered if the memory would fade when he was gone. Would the valley forget the power of sacrifice once his voice was no longer there to remind them? But each time doubt crept in, he saw proof around him. Neighbors sharing harvests with one another, children helping elders without being asked, riders offering their strength to the weak. The spirit of that long-ago dawn lived in them now. His choice had become their way of life. One autumn, as the leaves turned red and gold, the stranger returned with his riders one final time. They were older too, their hair streaked with gray, but their loyalty had not withered. They came not for battle, nor for ceremony, but simply to stand once more at the fence where it had all begun. "This place is more than a ranch," the stranger told him. "It is a reminder to us all. Long after we are gone, this story will still ride these plains." The rancher, moved beyond words, nodded with tears in his eyes. As the riders left, the rancher knew their words were true. The West would change, as all things do. Railroads would come, towns would rise, borders would shift. But some things were eternal, and among them would be the story of one poor man who gave all he had, and in doing so, gave everyone else a reason to believe. The end came quietly, as he always hoped it would. One evening, after sharing bread with neighbors and telling the children his story once more, the rancher sat on his porch, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. He closed his eyes with peace in his chest, his final breath carrying not regret, but gratitude. And when dawn came, the valley woke to the news that their humble hero had passed into memory. At sunrise, just as it had happened years before, riders appeared on the horizon. 100 strong, they rode in silence, their shadows long against the golden light. They dismounted at the same fence where the story began, and, as the valley gathered, they knelt once more, not before the man, but before his memory. It was their way of promising that the legend would never die. Tears fell freely, but with them came pride, the pride of a people bound by mercy. The valley marked his resting place not with stone, but with a wooden post carved with a single word: mercy. They did not need more. Everyone who passed through the land already knew whose grave it was. His story lived in their voices, in their choices, in the very soil where they worked and bled. For generations to come, parents would tell their children, "Remember the rancher who gave his only horse. Remember what came at dawn." And as years turned into decades, the story stretched even farther, reaching places the rancher himself had never seen. It crossed mountains, rivers, and borders, becoming not just a tale of the West, but a lesson for the world. That true power lies not in taking, but in giving. The rancher's name might fade, but his legacy would ride forever, carried in the hearts of those who believed in kindness. So it was that in the harsh land of the Old West, where so many names turned to dust, one man's mercy became immortal. The poor rancher who gave away his only horse left behind more than a valley. He left behind a truth that no storm, no hunger, no enemy could erase. That mercy, once given, multiplies, and its echoes carry farther than the sound 100 hooves at dawn. The story of the poor rancher stands as a reminder that the greatest acts of power are often born from sacrifice, not conquest. By giving away his only horse, he seemed to lose everything. Yet at dawn, 100 riders knelt at his fence, proving that mercy can summon strength the world cannot measure. His life teaches us that kindness is never wasted, and that in the harshest landscapes, it is compassion that carves a legacy strong enough to outlast the dust of time. Through his journey, we learn that true wealth is not in cattle or coin, but in the courage to give when giving feels impossible. The rancher's choice reshaped his valley, inspired generations, and turned a single act of generosity into a story that echoed far beyond the fences of his land. It was proof that a man's worth is not counted by what he owns, but by what he offers to others, especially when the cost is high. His story is also a challenge, a question left hanging in the air for every listener. What will you give when the moment comes? Will you hold tightly to what is yours, or will you dare to open your hand, trusting that mercy has a power deeper than fear? The Old West was unforgiving, yet even there, kindness triumphed. If it could bloom in that soil of dust and blood, it can bloom anywhere if we are willing to choose it. So when you look at your own life, remember the fence, the dawn, and the sound of 100 riders bowing to honor a man who gave when he had nothing. That moment lives not only in history, but in the choices we make each day. His act reminds us that we all have the power to turn loss into legacy, and a single sacrifice into a story that will be told long after we are gone. If this story stirred something within you, let it live on. Subscribe to the channel to walk with us through more tales that reveal the hidden power of humanity. Like the video if you believe that kindness can still change the world, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what this story means to you. Because legends like this are not meant to fade. They are meant to be remembered, carried, and passed on.